The last major historical event I want to talk a little bit about before we actually get to the 19th century is the American Revolution. And for our purposes, we don't need to spend a lot of time on wars and battles and politics. But one of the things we will discuss at length when we get to the 19th century is the influence of the idea of nationalism and national identity on work and sport and play and recreational behavior. So I want to make a few points about the cultural influence of the American Revolution and some ways in which it had an impact on styles of recreational culture deep into the 19th century. The American revolutionaries justified the legitimacy of their revolution to themselves and to the world with a body of political ideas that historians discuss under the rubric of republicanism. Republicanism is a means of expressing the idea of a government, the political legitimacy of which comes from duly elected representatives rather than from, say, a king. And Republican ideals were the basis on which the revolution was fought and justified. And they had a significant influence on what kind of public culture the founders tried to build into the new nation once they actually had a new nation on their hands in the 1780s and 1790s. And so let me make a few points about the political values of republicanism and some ways in which they had a long cultural influence in the United States into the 19th century. The basic premise of republicanism as understood by the founders was the idea that the ideal public actor, the ideal citizen, and the voter from whom political legitimacy must be generated was someone who was capable of exercising what they would have called public virtue, capable of thinking in terms of the public good, and therefore voting for representatives capable of legislating in the name of the public good. Because they were economically independent, because they were not dependent on their livelihood on others. When you hear the founders use the word independence, you should hear the root word. You should hear the word dependent and the state of not being dependent. And the American revolutionaries believed that individuals such as that, male landowners who had economic independence from property or from an ability to meet a tax-paying requirement, represented the ideal political actor. For example, the founders, if they had been asked directly, why don't children vote? Why don't women vote? Why don't slaves and indentured servants vote? Why don't wage earners vote? Those are all categories of person who they believed lacked the economic independence necessary to exercise public virtue in the public square, in the polity. And these were the ideas that the American revolutionaries used to justify their revolution against English political authority. And one of the consequences of this is that the founders spent a great deal of time and effort trying to build, in the early years of the American Republic, trying to build a public culture that they believed lived up to those ideas. For example, here we have an image of George Washington, which you may notice is on the plain side, in much the same way that the John Winthrop image was on the plain side. You have probably never encountered a picture of George Washington smiling. This was kind of on purpose. And the founders spent a great deal of the early history of the Republic being aware they were setting precedent the first time they did anything. And they went out of their way to set a relatively plain influence on public culture. And a classic example of this is one of the first things they argued about during the first Washington administration was what to call the President of the United States when you encountered him on the street. Should he have a title? The job of President of the United States was itself an an executive job that had been built around the perceived strengths and weaknesses of Washington. And so they had an argument about what do you call him if you see him. The vice president, John Adams, argued that the presidency ought to have a title of some kind. Not Your Royal Highness, not something that you would call a king, but there ought to be some authority vested in the office itself, separate from the person of George Washington, that should be invested in some kind of nomenclature. And that view lost out. And that view was essentially shouted down on the grounds that it would elevate the presidency to the status of aristocracy. And that idea of simplicity won out. And to this day, you refer to the President of the United States as Mr. President. To this day, he wears a common business suit. It's probably nicer than a suit in your closet, but the President of the United States does not wear a hat, does not carry a scepter, does not have military epaulets on his shoulder, which Washington certainly could have had if he'd chosen to have them because he was general. He's called Mr. as a cultural choice. And in the early days of the American Republic, the founders worked hard to establish that kind of plain, simple, virtuous, as they would have used the word public virtue, public culture. This had some influence on patterns of recreation and public culture. One of the consequences of this is that well into the 19th century, it was common to see Americans use words like aristocratic or aristocracy kind of as an insult, kind of as a swear word. And in the first half of the 19th century, to attack something as aristocratic was essentially to try to label something un-American. And the founders, in the aesthetic choices they made in the early republic, created a public culture that privileged certain kinds of recreational aesthetic. There were several states, particularly in the northern portion of the United States, in the early Republic period, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, that outlawed thoroughbred horse racing on the grounds that it was aristocratic. And that's one example of a recreational pattern that was influenced by this kind of culture of Republican simplicity that the founders attempted to build into the aesthetic of public life. And well into the 19th century, you will see Americans thinking of aristocracy as a swear word and an insult, even when it doesn't bear any obvious direct relationship to the actual premises of aristocracy. You'll see simplicity perceived as a national virtue. And one of the things we'll see a great deal of in the 19th century as we begin to talk about the emergence of a variety of sports and recreational patterns is the relationship between individuals investing identity and value in a sport and concepts of nationalism. And one of the points you want to keep in mind about American nationalism in the 19th century, as an idea, as a concept, as a culture, is that one strain of American nationalism that the founders managed to lay down in the public culture was the idea that American nationalism, as compared to England and as compared to Europe, should have a simplicity, should have a plainness, should have some kind of relationship to public virtue in the way the founders would have used that word to indicate political legitimacy.